Hello? Oh, there we go. All right, we're testing the volume. Great.
Calvary After Dark.
Okay. Good evening. Welcome to Calvary. It's good to be with you all tonight. I'm Scott Walters, rector here, and I'm glad to welcome you on behalf of this congregation. For those of you who haven't done this Wednesday night with us, there's a bit of a shtick here. What we're doing is, throughout the season of Lent, in Lenten Preaching Series, the Wednesday night event, we record a podcast episode live. So what we do tonight, it's going live stream, so we're doing it in real time, but it'll be trimmed and edited and dropped as a podcast later. So I'll start off. You're part of the podcast. It's live, so whenever something's hilarious, laugh forcefully, or if something's moves you, you can weeping in the aisles, whatever it is. But just join in as you feel led. But I will start the podcast by kind of introducing what's going on here, and it'll sound a little stilted, but that's what we're doing. Sound good? I'm glad to welcome you guys here. Are we ready to go, Heidi? Good? All right. Welcome again. This is Dialogue, a podcast of the Lenten preaching series recorded live at Calvary Episcopal Church in Memphis. I am Scott Walters, rector of Calvary Church. And our guests tonight are two local favorites at Calvary's Lenten preaching series. The Reverend Sam Teitel is newer to LPS, as we call it. He's a Unitarian Universalist minister who served at Church of the River in Memphis since 2017, correct? Mm-hmm. In a previous life, Sam was a slam poet, and I'm not going to try to explain what that is because I think it's probably more interesting just whatever image you have in your mind of what a slam poet is right now. But I think it's safe to say that he does bring a bit of a punk sensibility to his preaching and his ministry, but one that's beautiful and life-giving. So, Rabbi Micah Greenstein, senior rabbi at Temple, Israel, where he served for 30 years.
Since before Sam was born.
Yeah, that's right.
I was 4, thank you.
At a beautiful celebration of Micah's 30th anniversary that Ardell and I attended this year, I was really especially delighted to hear a story about when Micah preached at the National Cathedral in Washington, and a Calvary member was there on the front row, apparently, and she was asked, "Why did you come all this way to hear Micah Greenstein? You can hear him in Memphis." And she said, "Well, he's my rabbi too."
Oh.
A lot of us feel that way. Earlier today, these two guys did something that may be unprecedented in the 99 years of Lenten preaching series. I didn't look it up. I'd rather just assume it is. They preached together. They preached a dialogic sermon here, which is terrifying to most preachers, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it was a lovely day, and so welcome to you both.
Glad to be here.
So as we wade into this conversation, I know both of you pretty well, but I'd still like to just wade into it with a little bit of your stories as how you got into this clergy vocation. I think both of you came from clergy families. I'm curious if that was an impediment or an enticement.
Well, since it was his mother and my father, we'll start with mom's first.
Okay.
Not the same family.
Right.
But we grew up 10 minutes apart from each other.
We did, yeah. Marblehead, Massachusetts, and Peabody, Massachusetts. Peabody.
It's Peabody. They mispronounced the hotel here. It's Peabody, Mass.
And, when I lived there, I would have immediately known to say Peabody, but I've lived in Memphis for so long now that now I've started saying Peabody again. It's terrible.
But we survived being preachers' kids. What was your experience as the son of a minister?
My theory has... My wife is also a minister's kid, and my theory is there's two kinds of minister's kid. There's the minister's kid who was a perfect angel all the time, and there's the hellraiser. And my wife grew up as the former, and I grew up as the latter. Someone, I'm trying to remember who, I think it was Chris Rock, said growing up with a minister is like watching the magician stuffing the rabbit into the hat every morning. So, you go to church, you go to worship, and you know how all the tricks work. It's not magic in the same way. And so ministry is the way that I was most comfortable relating to faithfulness. Ministry is always how faithfulness was demonstrated to me. Our religious educators are our parents, right? And so what I saw of a religious life was embodied in ministry.
So it wasn't this secret trick. You actually saw the rabbit being stuffed into the hat, but it didn't bother you.
No,
it still was authentic. It was still a valid way of being in the world.
I think it's important that the rabbit go into the hat, right? I mean, I think it's important that we do this. And
this is all code. You have no idea what we're talking about. It's clergy code. Yeah, it's great.
I think, even knowing how the sausage gets made at churches, I think I was still excited to get into it, which has been helpful.
Well, I was pre-med, pre-law, pre-life. As I just told my Rhodes College students who were intimidated by their class with me, I said, but you have passed second semester organic chemistry. I ended my pre-med career before I received my grade in that subject. And my economics advisor, who was a devout Christian, knew that I was interested in the rabbinate, but then not. I was going to go into government after exploring these other possibilities. And I went to the Kennedy School of Government, and all my professors, or many of them, happened to be Jewish and moved me towards this path. And my father, who was my best friend, I still don't know how he did it. He was a Renaissance rabbi. He made the New York Metropolitan Opera Chorus in New York City, but knew that there wasn't a guaranteed career in the chorus of the New York Met. So he became a rabbi and a cantor, but as he said, he only got paid for one job. And he also earned a PhD in religious studies at Ohio State. But there's one story, though, that happened in Massachusetts, where I was born and where Sam grew up, that has really conditioned me as a rabbi. When he was the young youth rabbi at his congregation, it was a Thursday evening, I believe, and there was a youth conclave that weekend, and he saw the light on in the study of his senior rabbi, Rabbi Snyder. You didn't call him Scott at the time. And my dad was worried. So he went into Rabbi Snyder's study, and he said, are you okay? And Rabbi Snyder said, sit down, Howard. And he said, you have a lot of potential. You're going to be a fine rabbi, but let me tell you something. I'm married to this congregation, and if you want to be the star that you're destined to be, you need to be married to it too. That's why I'm here on a Thursday night. My dad told me that story because from that moment, he decided he would always be devoted to his congregation, but never married to it. Yeah. And that stayed with me, and after my dad asked me if I wanted to see a psychiatrist before going into the family business, it all ended up great, because I keep that story with me.
That's powerful. Yeah, I think...
Yeah, what about you? I mean, because having children, too, I mean, we each have sons and daughters. Not yet.
I don't have daughters.
You mean about watching the hat stuffing thing, or watching
yeah.
what the experience
In other words,
of it? I think the question of marriage or devotion or prior promises is really crucial in this line of work to get sorted out. And Ardell and I were married when we went to seminary, and we had 2 kids. And the strange thing, the interesting thing that might be related to what you're talking about is that all of the single seminarians had no idea how you had a family and you got your kids to school and you packed their lunch, did all the stuff and then still did your schoolwork. But the truth is that it structured your time, and it kind of aligned your priorities, and it should, at least. It did for us. And really helped with the school as well. The structure, it wasn't a zero-sum game. But it was important for us to ask that question. So where are your primary commitments? And is it even good for the congregation for you to be married to them rather than the person you actually promised fidelity to in a different way? It's seductive.
And it's a thing we always struggle with, right? Like, every clergy person has seasons where they get a little too married to their congregation. No matter how long you've been doing it and how hard you try to not do that, there's ebb and flow to it.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think our kids are the gut check. Maybe Gideon, not yet, although he's slapping you, I hear, to wake up in the morning. He's very young, right? He's
He's 25, yeah. He's 1.5.
No, if I'm preaching at the high holidays and the sanctuary's full, a temple, my son is the gut check, meaning he knows that I'm still his dad, even as I'm sincere in my role. Is that the lectern and not the pulpit? I know there's a test.
Yeah,
Okay.
well done.
Yeah.
Narthex.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the spouse and the kids keep us grounded.
Yeah.
Ideally.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's my story. Yours? Anything else? With Mom? She was an amazing UU minister.
She was an amazing UU minister. She was one of the best. Yeah, she... One of the things that I say is, my preaching professor said is, there's things that are necessary, or not necessary, but really helpful to be a good preacher. And one of them is you have to have grown up hearing good preaching. And so that I feel really lucky that I got to grow up hearing great preaching from, and it was great that it was from my mom. Same.
My dad said to me that if you haven't struck oil in 18 minutes, stop boring. Really said. Yeah.
Well, maybe preaching's a good. Let's talk a little bit about preaching and your approach to that. So that's one part of the clergy life, but it's one that during Lenten preaching series we're attending to. It's also something that's communal. It happens in the context of these other relationships that are ongoing and going throughout life in the congregation and family and what. It's also intensely private. There's a private part that's really reflective. That's if you're an introvert, that's where you get fed in the profession, You guys kind of broke that today. Talk about preaching and how you were drawn into that part of your vocation. And go.
I went first last time.
You have better sneakers than I.
I do. Okay, fair enough. Preaching, I was a slam poet for a while before I was a minister. And it's this interesting thing that people ask, do you miss being a slam poet? And the answer is no. No, that I was trying to preach. That preaching was the act of preaching is always what I was going for, and I just didn't realize that that's what I was trying to do. Mm-hmm. And a slam poem is by definition 3 minutes long, so you learn an economy of language.
At 2, stop boring if it's not working. No.
If only slam poets would stop boring when it wasn't working. They often don't. They just stay. And preaching is, I like what you said about it being connective and it being a communal experience. It is a moment that you can share. I don't give out copies of my sermons ever. People have asked me if they can have the transcript, and I always say no. And part of it is that I write it sort of in a weird, almost like it were a slam poem, like I write it sort of down the page in this way that's really easy for me to read, but no one would really be able to read it. I also really love the idea that a sermon is a thing that happens in a moment in time, and it's this thing that we all shared, and it's okay to have it just be a thing that happened once in our life and then we let it go, and we don't have to own it and we don't have to keep it.
I'm not just saying this because you're my colleagues and friends, but you're great preachers too, who I think share with me the person in the back of this sanctuary has a right to ask the question at every sermon. And I always live in holy, not fear, but I'm conscious of the question. I always imagine the person in the back, and I see her asking the question as I'm preaching, so what?
It's real.
that so many of you have gotten dressed to come hear this talk. And I think the irony of preaching is that it's either rabbinocentric or the pulpit is so high, but what really matters is what's going on with them out there and not up here. And I don't know about the UU Episcopal Church, but in my stream of Judaism, a group of us are very concerned about the loss of the sermon, not because we're older, but because it's harder to write. For instance, it's a joke I think we got from Christians. How long does it take to prepare an hour sermon? I could talk for an hour right now. How long does it take to prepare a well-honed 15 to 18-minute sermon? 3 days. So many rabbis and ministers are into the discussion sermon, where you pose a question. And I don't think I'm divulging any secrets. That's a heck of a lot easier than writing 5 drafts.
Yeah.
So I really admire your preaching, Scott and Sam. And I work hard at it myself. It's not easy.
Yeah, that's helpful.
The discussion sermon is so dangerous, though. Handing out a mic in the middle of church is just a thing that I always try to avoid as much as I possibly can.
Yeah, but you play like Jerry Springer. I don't know if it doesn't end that way, but Phil Donahue. It's the, yeah, right. But that, I don't know. That may not be happening in your world because I know the sermon is still very much valued in your pulpits, right?
Yeah.
It is in mine too. But I think it's becoming more of a lost art.
Well, it's interesting that while it seems in the moment it's one directional. Somebody stands there and speaks in that direction, and in Episcopal Church we don't expect people to speak back, but in wilder churches they do. But one directional in a sense, but you're talking about a sense of that person on the back row whose story you may or may not know.
Who said, Scott, you were speaking to me, not, oh, that was so profound. And
yeah. And having that matter actually, it's making me think of your comment about this intense preparation. Like being true to that is not having a flippant conversation. Being true to that is like, I need to attend to what I have to attend to and bring forth the best I can in this context. And the liturgy shapes it and it says, placing it in this context, it's...
No, that was just that was an emphatic yes. That was an agreement. I think a lot of preaching is really bad. like a lot of preaching is really bad, and I think a lot of ministers are really exhausted, and really don't have a lot of time in their lives to devote to their preaching, which is part of what makes it bad. But I think the art of the sermon would maybe be in better shape. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. But it's a thing that a lot of us and a lot of our colleagues aren't really able to devote that much time to, aren't really able to put much of ourselves into. And it shows, and I think it shows in the attendance in our churches. I think it shows in the sort of state of American religion is, church has to be really good for people to come back. We don't live in an era where you have to go to church, where if you're the person who doesn't go to church, that's weird. If anything, sort of the opposite. So you have to be able to give them something of value, something that will affect them and change them every week.
you said something though really important. I don't want it to come across as though it's the fault of today's minister. She or he has to lead services for babies, be good with elders, and also be charismatic with the teens. I'm told that one of my predecessors, one of the greatest preachers of all time, Rabbi Wax of blessed memory, who some of you may have known before, another great preacher, Rabbi Danziger, that he would spend 3 days on his sermons. And he would sit in his rocking chair at the old temple at Poplar, Montgomery, and people would occasionally come in. And so time is so scarce. I wish we had a 30-hour day, then we'd have 6 more. But do have time to work on your sermons 3 days? I don't.
Yeah, no.
Except for this one today.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that sermon took so long. Worth it.
A lot of coffee.
So much coffee.
Let's talk about that one. Affirming all of this, right? That sermons matter, we believe still, and that if church, if synagogue, if temple, if these religious communities matter, we still at least have drunk the Kool-Aid and believe a sermon is essential to that.
Yeah.
You two, what were you thinking? What were you thinking today? What brought on this idea of actually, let's try something?
It was his idea. I thought he was crazy. I still think he is, but it turned out all right.
Wrong. Yeah, I thought it turned out pretty good.
We were just talking, and that abracadabra came out, and said, let's talk about I speak, therefore I create, and what are all the extensions of that idea.
And it was clear that you didn't get up here and riff today. You had tended to this sermon, right? I mean, you had tended this thing. And so talk to us about that, especially thinking about sermons matter, looking ahead. We, as people of faith, need to attend to what a sermon means and what a sermon does. And it may not be exactly the same thing when they were 62 minutes long in 1844. So go ahead. Sorry. What were you thinking? How did this process come to be, and why would you try something like this?
I mean, so I feel like it's funny. I keep bringing up the slam thing, which I very rarely talk about. But in the slam poetry world, it's common for poets to write together, and it's common to do a piece that will have a group piece. Will have 2, 3, 4, 5 poets on stage, having different roles. And it's a powerful thing to see. It's an amazing thing to see. And I was thinking about that, about how I think so much good art, and we don't have to have the is preaching art conversation, but I would call it art. So much good art comes out of collaboration, and I was thinking it's such a shame that there's just not a lot of collaborative preaching. That's just it's not a thing you would see nearly as often. And I thought, well, let's try it. I'll see if Micah might just be crazy enough to do this with me. So you just did your first group piece, Micah.
I'm a slammer.
Yep.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah, man.
No, I taught for 25 years at Memphis Theological Seminary, and I once saw a bumper sticker that didn't remind me of the two of you. It's not a Jewish bumper sticker for sure, and I don't think it's the kind of Christian bumper sticker or UU sticker you would put on your car. It said, "God said it, I believe it, that settles it." A Jewish bumper sticker, or I imagine an Episcopal or UU bumper sticker would say, "God said it, I believe it. Now let's discuss what on earth it means."
Yeah.
So there's a comfort zone with bright people, which not only he, you, many other peers are, who see the sermon as a midrashic opportunity to make whatever your Torah is, if it's Christ, if it's Muhammad, your Torah, to make your Torah fit the world rather than the world fit your simple, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. And that, to me, that's what bad preaching is, where does an eye for an eye really justify the death penalty? You may be able to justify it other ways, but the whole point of that is, I'm not wearing glasses and you are, so how can we say that? We need systems of justice. So anyway, I see the sermon as an opportunity to connect and relate. And I hear that in your preaching. I've trolled you a little.
Yeah, and it's a tension, isn't it? I love the tension between having the text make a claim on me that I wouldn't, to take me someplace I wouldn't go on my own, like have a power, so it's not just me spewing.
Yeah.
Right? And at the same time, my Lenten practice has been reading Aviva Zornberg, and so I'm just dipping into this. But the Midrash, Rashi and these people, they had this imagination that seemed to grow faithfully out of the story, but go in spectacular directions. How do you all do this in your respective traditions? What is it in the practice that takes, I have to be true to this thing that I may not want to be true to, and yet I have space to actually imagine it into the world we believe it? Does that make any sense?
I'll go first on this because
You go
something
first.
just came to mind. So
Please.
I read Aviva Zornberg too, Zornberg. She'll change your life in reading Scripture exegetically. So he and I were talking about Ezekiel, who I see as absolutely fascinating because you talked about coal on the lips. He eats an entire scroll.
That's my first LPS sermon, man.
He doesn't just, was it Isaiah? They talk about prostitutes, he actually goes with the paramours. Ezekiel has these, but I see him as a Jewish man who had a passion for social justice. We pick out those pieces, but also was interested in ritual. And I will look at Jewish sources to understand that we don't understand Ezekiel's vision of the fiery chariot, right? So I asked my friend Sam at Crosstown,
Can't believe you're going to say
what
that.
do you think he saw? And Sam said, it's easy, it's one word. I said, what? He said, aliens. So there's the tension. There's the tension.
Spinning wheel in the sky, man.
Yeah.
It's a flying saucer.
He said, it's aliens.
Yeah. Maybe.
There's a tension between this exegesis and
Yeah.
eisegesis.
Yeah.
And I think you have to stay there, right? Because what I've never been able what I've never liked is when people say, no, man, you have to say exactly what the text says. You can't put your own agenda into it at all. And like that's
Impossible.
that's not a thing you can do. You always have your own agenda. You're always doing that, and it's so much better to own it and to just acknowledge. So this is what's happening now. I needed the text to say this, so that's what it says.
Well, in all seriousness, every text has a context. We do know that, for instance, Ezekiel lived before the destruction of the temple, and he was with the exiles in Babylon, probably wealthy people who were kicked out by Nebuchadnezzar. So there is a context to all of this, and we have our own, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the New Testament Ezekiel is strange book of Revelation. Strange images, and this moment that I had that changed me with regard to context was in seminary and having Roger Furlow, who was my spiritual director, mentor at the time, and we were at chapel, we're reading one of these things, and it's just swords and lambs and blood and all this stuff. And I'm looking at him, and he's kind of leaning his head over, listening, taking it all in. We walk over after chapel, and I don't know what's going on, and he says, Scott, what were those people going through?
Wow.
Who wrote that story down? Who needed that kind of imagery to somehow convey? What were they going through? Which is very different from this flat, literal, here's on the text, you got to believe it, and here's the code to unpack. But actually, no, people we might actually have some trust for needed these sometimes violent, sometimes frightening images to convey what was going on in their lives and in the world. And that's a different kind of trust of the text than it's written down, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. That unsettles everything, actually, to bring the other people into that conversation. Well, let's take this, too. There's something similar, I think, that goes on with regard to interfaith friendships. Both a fidelity to one's own spiritual tradition, right? We're formed in a context, and then also a conversation that spreads out to say, maybe I could learn something from this tattooed Unitarian guy who doesn't practice in the same way. Talk about maybe where interfaith friendships, relationships started to come into your life. Was it from the beginning that you understood this as a reality, or was there a moment when you realized, outside my own tradition, there are these important perspectives I need to I need to hear?
Let's give credit to where it's due, and I think it's our parents, too.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? That's exactly what I was going to say, yeah. So I am the product of an interfaith marriage. My mom was a UU minister. My dad is Jewish. So it's interesting having a Jewish dad, not a Jewish mom, because that gets really complicated in terms of, do you count as, I say I'm Jewish. Actually, the first time that Micah and I met, do you remember the first thing you ever said to me before, "Hi, I'm Micah"?
I do not.
I was interviewing for my job at Church of the River, and I go to Temple Israel, and Micah walks up to me and just sort of looks me up and down and says, "You look more Jewish than I do."
With the beard, more like a rabbi.
And
right.
and I said, "Sam Teitel, what were you expecting?" And then I got a headlock. It was, and we've loved each other ever since.
That's right.
So yeah, and also in Unitarian Universalism, I mean, a UU congregation is in its way an exercise in interfaith dialogue, right? I have Christians in my congregation. I have atheists. I'm kind of Jewish-ish. I have Muslims. I have some pagans. Like the notion of the value in someone else's theology is, I mean, that's kind of baked in.
Fear, I think Maya Angelou said this, brings out the worst in us. Fear. I really think interfaith dialogue brings out the best in us, because it's like going to someone else's birthday party. You know what yours is, but you can deepen your own understanding of this limitless love from God. It's like the Methodist minister, I want to give credit where it's due, who said, "I live in a cul-de-sac and I have a son, and this son thinks he has the best mother in the world. But then there's a neighbor who also has a son, and he says he thinks he has the best mom in the world. And one across the street has a daughter who says, I have the best mom in the world." And the minister poses the question, how can they all be right? And the answer, of course, is, I hope they are, right? So I think one of the differences, it's a bit facile to say this, but you have an interfaith congregation. We're in like a cathedral in here, where I see each of the stained glass windows as a different faith tradition, and they're all beautiful, and they all point to a larger God. So in one sentence, Judaism would say the world will become a better place because of our differences, because at the end of 2 Chronicles, the end of our Bible, or in Zechariah, everybody goes up to the mountain of God when there's no more war or disease, as they are, as whoever they are. So my life, and I think that's the gift of Memphis, are these relationships that are so genuine across all lines. The only other thing I'll say, though, about my Jewish friend is when I heard he was Teitel, I didn't see anything about Reverend, and I saw the beard, I thought he was the male rabbi in the synagogue. I mean, we're not a gene pool, Jews are not a race, it's a matter of consent, not descent, and I just love learning from my Episcopal friends, my Catholic friends, my Muslim friends. It makes me a better Jew. I think you could become more particular with your universality and have a greater appreciation of the universal with the particular. It's the syncretism that bothers me, these Messianic Judaism. We're all Messianic Jews, but the ones who call themselves Jews for Jesus, that's like kosher pork, or, you know, if a Christian becomes a Mormon, you don't call them Christians for Smith. You know, there's an integrity to the cross. You don't bend it and say it's a star. It's an insult to the integrity of both. So I love interfaith, just not syncretism.
Yeah, that's helpful.
What about you? I mean, what do you love about it? I'm just going to put it on you. You keep
I don't
asking
like
us.
it. I'm against
Yeah,
it.
I thought so. They're forcing you to do this. It's in your contract.
was
The
up to him,
rector
we
has
wouldn't
to do interfaith.
If it was up to him, we wouldn't even be here.
That's
man.
right. That's right.
Yeah,
Let's
go.
Yeah, let's go. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, he's one. I agree. This is really helpful for you to mention that the difference between syncretism and maybe a cafeteria, I'll have a little of this and a little of that, but or a practice that has a center to it. And I grew up in a more evangelical, more fundamentalist milieu, that one of the gifts of that is not this. There wasn't good interfaith. That wasn't a sense. It was like we're on the inside and people on the outside. We love people, but we need to find a way to bring them in. And that doesn't work for me anymore. I don't think it's scriptural. But one thing it does is it is about attending to the integrity of this way of being in the world as a community. And so it moves further over in the direction you're talking about. And when you say, I think, Micah, it makes me a better Jew. It makes my practice be cohere, be more consistent, have more integrity. There is a value of that, and I feel like I do need friends who tend to be more conservative about their practice of Christianity to keep me where I need to be. What was hard was that it cut off these other relationships that I've come to depend on. And actually, I heard a wonderful talk about this years ago in seminary by Rowan Williams, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He pushed so far to say he thinks a fruitful interfaith relationship and dialogue should not be limited to the things we agree about.
Absolutely.
Because what real, deep, meaningful relationship that you have in your life only talks about the things you agree about? And he said, I actually think my Jewish brothers and sisters should press me and say, do you believe God is one? You don't talk like it sometimes. And a deep, meaningful, trusting relationship could actually go the places where at least the language in our different traditions seems to pull at each other, and that there would be depth to relationship that could happen. Is that possible? Have you experienced that?
Barbara Brown Taylor's book explicates exactly what you're saying. I love what you're saying. Don't you?
Yeah. No, it's not dialogue if you're just kind of patting each other on the back. I mean, that's not meaningful.
Yeah, it's kind of like, marriage. You don't want someone who makes you happy. Of course, you want someone who makes you better. Because if they make you better, you'll also be happy. But if you're just happy, and so that's what I love about deep dialogue or deep disagreement and wrestling, rather than a rabbi, a minister, and a priest giving a benediction at a chicken dinner. That was really a big deal with Will Herberg's Protestant Catholic Jew, back in the 50s. But I think we're getting deeper, and we ought to. With holy envy, as she says.
Yeah, that's Barbara's term. Yeah. And it seems like it depends on some trust, the deepening trust to be able to go into different places with the dialogue, with the friendship. We have to.
Oh, yeah.
And it involves, and therefore there's an element of healing, right? There's an element of, part of, if we have religious groups that have been at odds, right, and we are part of groups that have been at odds, we also need to not just say, well, now everything's fine immediately, so we're all gonna now tell me about you and I'll tell you about me, right? Like it necessitates, pulling out the dirty laundry sometimes and sort of being able to get that handled. Am I making sense?
Mm-hmm. You're reminding me of two unfortunate interfaith incidents I had in Memphis over the last 30 years. But because of the trust, I was able to correct. The first was I was on sabbatical for a few months, but unfortunately I was watching Sunday morning television live from a very large church in Memphis with a huge audience. And the pastor, instead of extolling Christianity, used Judaism as the whipping post, that God was only a distant father, but Jesus introduced God as a more imminent friend. So I knew him, and I said, who taught you that in seminary? I'll give you 50 Hebrew words about God as a sister, a friend, a mother. And I said, you could do a lot of damage, because I was on a treadmill, and you have 4,000 people in your congregation. The other one was where around this time for Passover, I was invited to this large church in Memphis to speak about the symbols of Passover. So I go into the adult education class, and they said, oh, another rabbi, we just heard about Passover last week. I said, tell me what you learned. They said, well, you know the flatbread, that matzah? And I said, yes. I have it here. I brought a show and tell. I said, do you know what it symbolizes? And they said, yeah, this rabbi pastor came last week and told it looks like the stripes of Jesus on the cross. And I said, it's 3 words. It's freedom from slavery. So I felt close enough to the senior pastor there, who was conservative, to say, forget about learning about Judaism from a Jew versus someone who doesn't, but let's stay in our lanes. Like, I want to know New Testament from you. But I think it's when interfaith becomes supersessionist that it's tragic.
Yeah.
And it can take a long time to heal. I mean, are we going to bring up can I bring up?
I never know where you're going, and there are a lot of people here. Is this going to be okay?
What are you going to say?
Is this going to be okay?
So my penultimate predecessor was a guy named James Madison Barr. And your predecessor was, now you know where I'm going with this, Rabbi Wax.
I think it's okay.
Yeah, no, there was no love lost between James Madison Barr and Rabbi Wax. Those two guys had nothing good to say about each other.
Explain why, please.
Because James Madison Barr was absolutely on the wrong side of the civil rights movement, and said a lot of really deeply problematic things. So Rabbi Wax was absolutely right to be wary of him. But it means something now for the minister of Church of the River and the rabbi of Temple Israel to be here on this chancel together. It means something from an interfaith perspective as well as from an institutional perspective. It means something for the three of us to be here having this conversation.
Well, Calvary was always on the right side, you know. No, it does. Thank you. No, you're right. This moment is precious. You're right, given the history.
Yeah.
No question.
You know, and you know, we need to talk about, there's people in my congregation who can tell you, and I believe them, that James Madison Barr did really beautiful, meaningful ministry in their lives. And still, we need to be able to talk about
Facing history and what was in the parking lot.
Right, and why these things are fraught.
Amen.
Yeah, yeah. And that's so, this idea of the cruel God of the Old Testament, of those people's religion, the divisive. The sad thing is that within these strange stories, we have the resources to say, what were our forebears saying? Why were they telling it? Oh, maybe they came from someplace we can trust. We can learn these things from these traditions. And well, as we think about this series, this Lenten preaching, it's the 99th year. So we're turning toward another 100, we hope. And we talked a little bit about preaching earlier. It's grown into a more interfaith. I will tell a story quickly that if you read the history of Calvary, going back to the early 20th century, there was a tradition that started bringing an American flag in, and there was a poem written by the rector that referred to the Crusades and people kneeling at the altar of Calvary in Muslim blood in their chainmail. So that's part of our history, is that people were writing in these just a century ago. So we are not there at all. Come to this century, a few years ago, on the day that there was the shooting in New Zealand at the mosque. It was Lenten preaching series, and now I'm blanking from Duke.
Yasser Qadi? The Duke.
Omid Safi.
Safi.
Omid Safi was preaching, and the news came that morning that someone had walked up to the synagogue, was greeted in peace, as one would always be, and then committed this horrible crime. Omid stepped up into that pulpit an hour or two after that and preached a stunning sermon about what that brought forth in him. So part of telling the whole story is that we have traditions that are complicated and have complicated stories like all of our families do, but we can move into different places. So I got sidetracked telling that story, but the question going forward, so we become a more interfaith, even just series than we were once upon a time. What do we need to attend to going forward to make sure this Lenten preaching series matters?
More silence.
We're doing that on Tuesdays.
What do you think as a relative newcomer to this experience?
And we're at a moment when fewer people are coming to church.
Can I tell a story?
Yeah,
How's our time?
we're fine. A couple minutes, then we'll ask some questions out here.
I used to go to a slam show at Ralph's Rock Diner in Worcester, Massachusetts, and called the Dirty Gerund. And what was amazing is there would be slam poets who would, get up and do their thing, but it was just part of the culture of the show that people would get up and do something completely bizarre. There was a guy who called They Might Be Puppets, who had these two parrot puppets, and he would play songs by the band They Might Be Giants, and the puppets would lip sync the song, and that was his act. And there was a guy who would do, march in place and sing commercials from the 90s. I guess my point is having,
Puppets? Puppets?
Yeah, puppets
Okay.
is what you need. Having them there, it's what made the poetry good. It's what made the room good. It's what made the bringing in an element of the unexpected, bringing in an element of, we are going to have the thing that you love, but also something weird might happen. Something you don't expect might happen. I think that's how we do good church. And all you need to do to matter is to do good church.
Yeah. I think it also comes back to what Ray Charles said about music. I don't care what kind it is, as long as it's good.
Yeah.
And we know good preaching when we hear it. There are singers, for instance, even though I listen to them on the way down. If James Taylor's performing, I will go see him live. If Judy Collins is performing, I would go see her. She's still doing it. He's still doing it. Mm-hmm. Paul McCartney stays up later than I do. Now, there are singers who should hang it up. I mean, another Jew named Robert Zimmerman, Bob Dylan's real name. We never could understand him. He's a poet. Yeah. You don't know what you're getting right now. So I met someone this week who told me I met Dan Matthews. Now, for those listening and don't know, this is the rector of Trinity Church Emeritus, who I guess has been coming here a long time.
This was the 50th year since he showed up first.
And he is a man of grace. I met him when I started here 22 years ago, and he is the kind of preacher who will stop when it's time for him to stop, but he still got it. And I would just say, yeah, bring the puppets, but realize how rare this is, and there still are preachers who not only value preaching, but there's an audience for anything good, whether it's music, art, poetry, and even this. So I trust not only my brothers and sisters, I trust Calvary to discern that in a high-minded way, as you always have for 99 years.
Amen. Thank you, too, for being with us tonight. Dialogue is a podcast of Calvary's Lenten preaching series, a 99-year-old tradition that invites wise and inspiring preachers of many faith traditions into our pulpit during the season of Lent and onto this podcast beyond. Dialogue's produced by Noah Glenn of Perpetual Motion. Our theme music was composed by Spence Bailey. Special thanks to Robin Banks, Director of Communications at Calvary, and Heidi Rupke, Lenten Preaching Series Coordinator, and Sam Bryant, our sound engineer, and thanks to you for listening. If you're curious about the home of Dialogue and the Lenten Preaching Series, Calvary Episcopal Church is an eclectic bunch of Christian people. We don't all think the same thoughts or dress the same way or vote for the same candidates or even believe all the same things about the mystery of God and what it means to be human. But we do believe that we need each other because of our differences, not in spite of them. That God calls us out of estrangements and conflict into unity, not uniformity. Do we have time for a couple of questions?
Yeah. No rush.
Heidi
this went so fast. I mean, only half the people are sleeping, so.
Who has a question? Someplace we didn't quite go in our meandering. Let's see, Ed. Heidi will bring you one, Ed, in just a second.
Mine is not a question as much as it is an observation. When I left the waffle shop today, I was riding on the shuttle back to the cathedral, and I was surrounded by women who go to church on the river, and they did nothing but sing your praises the entire time. And these are mostly white-haired women, and you are a Jewish tattooed man, and they love you.
Well, thank you so much.
Ed had a question right there.
Let's just cap it there.
I know you're short of time, but any thoughts about how we bridge these great divides, both politically and religiously?
Yeah, what do we
The
do?
great divide.
Politically and religiously. One thing we should say, I think. Go ahead.
No, I think one thing we should do is model the way forward rather than talk about the divide. And there's room for political disagreement, for instance, on poverty, but enough watching which news station you watch. What's your solution to it? Whoever you are. If you're a Republican, if you're a Democrat. So I think talking about issues and principles that transcend. I didn't know, when I went to the Washington National Cathedral and I was given a tour, I didn't realize it was built in the highest spot in Washington, D.C., because religion's supposed to transcend that, the political divide. So I'm the only rabbi of a synagogue with congressmen from two political parties who are Jewish. That doesn't keep me from preaching on any issue, but Gam ze yavor is the Hebrew. This too shall pass, but there's a B part to it. This too shall pass, but enduring the passing is hard as hell. So I think we need to model more. That would be part of my answer rather than building up walls, bridges. What do you think, though? Is there political divide in your congregation?
Yes.
Really?
But it is divided between liberal and very liberal. Which gets brutal, man. Like,
Really?
I have never seen people go after each other like a room of people trying to demonstrate that they are more liberal than everybody else in the room. I've never, oh yeah, man. I guess I would say the two things I would say. One is the way to heal the divisiveness is one, get off of Twitter and Facebook. I mean, we need to use social media because that's a part of our world, but do not let that become a part of your life that informs the way you see the world more than your actual relationships inform the way you see the world. And form meaningful personal relationships. The way that you bridge divides is by actually being able to see and interact with each other as human beings.
And one other thing I would add is, in this week of King, King was not a dreamer. He was a strategist. He knew exactly why he went into Selma, because the sheriff of Selma was a Bull Connor and not a Pritchard in Albany, Georgia, where they put 1,466 protesters in there. But he was a nice bigot, Pritchard. He was like a George Wallace bigot with a bow tie. Be nice to them. He was as racist as any of them. He said, give them lemonade. Now, thanks to them, we got We Shall Over. That's where it was written. All those songs were written in there. Bull Connor, you remember the dogs, bite the kids. White America had to see that brutality. King's first question when he came to Selma to John Lewis at age 23 was, is the sheriff of this town a Bull Connor or a Pritchard? And when he said Bull Connor, King said, we're going in. You might ask yourself, why? And he knew that to reveal the good, you have to unveil the evil. He knew people were going to die. That's why he hesitated on the bridge. There's a lot of this. People don't realize the thinking, the strategy. So I think to reveal the good, we have to unveil the evil. That's what we're seeing with Ukraine and Russia. So I think we need to strategize better. I think a lot of liberals, maybe the very liberal wing of his congregation are part of it. I mean, it's like an echo chamber, or the hard right's an echo chamber. There's no strategy. Enough of being right. If you want to win, and the Israeli government just fell down last night. Did y'all read about that? I want to talk about a political divide. Israel makes the former President Trump and anti-Trumpers mild, they're like the NAACP in Israel, the way they get. I mean, it's 61-59, because you have to get 120. It's a parliamentary democracy. You have to get 61 in your coalition. There are like 13 different parties. So if he's a party, she's a party, I'm a party, he's a party, you may have 4 votes, you have 7, so it was 61-59, and the one who made the majority was an Arab Muslim religious party. He joined the governing coalition, but his one condition was that the gay health minister not sanction same-gender marriages, because he's a Muslim religious party. Meanwhile, Netanyahu, who was in the bloc of 59, very good friend of the former president, has been plotting to take over, and it happened last night. So what was it over? You hear about this? Did everybody know about this? I guess you don't read the same newsfeed. Get this. I'm not making this up. On Passover, you don't eat bread. So in the hospitals, they keep Passover. It's a Jewish state. Well, the health minister, this guy from Meretz, by the way, all our COVID information, Pfizer, it all comes from Israel, all under this guy who's a liberal, happens to be gay, and he's the health minister, and he was just saying, 74% of Israel is Jewish, but 21% is Arab, and there are other Christians. So maybe, we shouldn't have that policy in the hospital. Like, if you want to bring in kosher for Passover food, fine, but oh my God, that inflamed the equivalent of the white Christian nationalists. We're a Jewish state. Like, you can't bring in a ham sandwich or bread into the house of a hospital. And so one woman in the right-wing coalition has defected to the Netanyahu side and could literally bring down the government tonight. Now, is it really about matzah and Passover? Not really. They've been plotting this divide. How do we take over? How do we get the 61? And what worries me about our country is everybody's in their silos. Everybody's in their own pickleball group. Everybody's, whatever it is, and no one is strategizing how to build a center. So I think that's what we need. We need more strategy rather than people being righteous. Yeah. I'm sorry for the rant, but I can't believe Israel government could come down over matzah.
Strategy that's not secure. Yeah. And strategy that's not strategizing about securing power for Mike.
Yeah,
Continue.
exactly.
That's where the strategy goes, rather than bridging, how do I learn to talk to someone across the
No, repeat that. Yeah, that's it. Strategizing the bridge rather than, right.
Well, it's 20 past. You all have been lovely to listen to this rambling conversation we've enjoyed. Thanks for coming tonight.
Coming out.
Coming in. Thanks.
I don't know if it was worth it, but.
Kids are on the third floor. Parents, if you got kids, they're on the third floor. Oh, and Novel is outside as well as Thistle and Bee when you're going by if you want to grab some gifts from them. Thanks for coming tonight, y'all.